Hey everybody, this is Pastor Sullivan answering your questions with ATP Ask the Pastor. Today we've got a question about church governance. Someone asks, "Hello Pastor, can you write to me about what the Bible teaches about church government? Congregational, Episcopal, or Synodical? I'm an Orthodox Lutheran theologian from Brazil. God bless you." Brazil, that's awesome. I wasn't aware that we had anybody in Latin America watching ATP. First of all, welcome to Ask the Pastor. Second of all, thanks for watching. As far as your question goes about church government, the scriptures really don't have much to say about the way in which the churches should be governed. Whether on a local level or on a national level, or as far as a group of churches go together. The main thing that God has given for the governance of the church is the office of the holy ministry. And so whether it's in a local congregation or within a national body or a group of churches, then I think the really only thing that we should watch out for is our governance shouldn't take the authority or the office of the keys away from the people to whom it is given, the office of the ministry and whatnot. But I think generally speaking, there's a lot of room for churches individually and corporately to govern themselves as they see fit. There's a lot of freedom in this. The scripture doesn't come down and say, thou shalt use Robert's rules of order, or thou shalt organize thyself in such a way. And so locally, whether you have a voters' assembly or not, it's kind of it's a non sequitur. It really doesn't matter as long as people aren't usurping the pastoral office, and also then as long as the pastor isn't being an autocrat, coddling the congregation in his iron fist. So now, you ask specifically a congregational, episcopal, or synodical here. Congregational is what we see a lot in North America, at least, where the congregation kind of runs the show, whether that's in a voters' assembly or a board of directors or something like that. Again, these sorts of things are okay as long as you're not voting on doctrine, because doctrine doesn't get voted on. Doctrine is not ours, it's Christ's. It's either true or it's false. But then also, like we said before, as long as it doesn't usurp the pastoral office, the office which Christ has established and given to the church for the sake of giving the forgiveness of sins, administering the sacraments, teaching the faith, etc., these sorts of things. And sadly, what we see a lot in North America is that congregational mindset I guess the backside of that, or the flip side of that, is that oftentimes they end up treating the pastor as a hireling or as an employee to be hired and fired at will instead of what he is. That doesn't make congregational polity bad. That's just something to watch out for. Synodical polity, that's kind of a misnomer. Historically speaking, a synod was a gathering of pastors, a gathering of bishops. And so for a fellowship or an association of churches to be called a synod, again, is kind of a misnomer, and it's kind of being nitpicky, but words do mean things. Most of the time in North America, at least, what we see with synods is synods run according to business models. And so it's not so much based on the office of the ministry, but it's rather based on the idea of bureaucracy, elected offices, these sorts of things. That has its pros. It also has its cons. And myself personally, having come out of one of the Lutheran synods in North America, I see it as being more detrimental to the church. And by that I mean, I don't think it's good to have elected bureaucrats who don't have calls to serve congregations. I think the further a man in the church gets away from an altar and a pulpit, the more dangerous and tenuous things become. So that would be a word of caution about synodical types of governance. Anything where you're using a worldly frame or a worldly schematic and putting it over the church, even a body of churches, I think that becomes problematic. Kind of like the congregational view of things, where congregations just have all the authority, even over a pastor. Finally, then, you mentioned the Episcopal. And this is the one that I'm going to give the 2 thumbs up to, strictly because the Lutheran confessions talk about this. And not only do the Lutheran confessions talk about this, but they say, Melanchthon writes in the Apology of the Augsburg Confession, Article 14, that the episcopal form of governing the church is the Lutherans' preferred way. It's the historical way. It's one that goes all the way back into the early church. In fact, St. Ignatius of Antioch even mentions it several times in his letters, but especially in his letters to the Trallians. There in the paragraph 3 of Ignatius' letter to the Trallians. Correspondingly, everyone must show the deacons respect. They represent Jesus Christ. just as the bishop has the role of the father, and the presbyters, pastors, are like God's council and an apostolic band. You cannot have a church without these. I'm sure that you agree with this. Now, aside from what he's saying about the tripartite, the tripartite office within the church, man-made as it is, echoing or foreshadowing, or however you want to say that, the Trinitarian interrelationship, Ignatius confesses the fact that already within the 100s they had bishops, presbyters, pastors, and deacons, assistant pastors, if you will. And so that has been all the way from the times of the New Testament. Think about in Timothy and Titus, the office of overseer or bishop is one, and then they talk about presbyters, and they also talk about the office of deacons. It may not have been as concrete as it was even by Ignatius's time in the early 100s, early to mid 100s. However, what the church did was they took what St. Paul established in his pastoral epistles, and they ran with it. And so that's always been the polity of the church up until the last couple hundreds of years. Now, we mentioned the Lutheran confessions, and this is something that I think, as a Lutheran, all Lutherans ought to take seriously. In Article 14 of the Apology of the Augsburg Confession, Melanchthon writes this. Let's see. Concerning this subject, we have frequently testified in this assembly that it is our greatest wish to maintain church polity and the grades in the church, old church regulations, and the government of bishops, even though they have been made by human authority, provided the bishops allow our doctrine and receive our priests. For we know that church discipline was instituted by the fathers in a manner laid down in the ancient canons with a good and useful intentions. And then if we go down a little bit further, in this manner our consciences are not in danger because we know that our confession is true, godly, and Catholic. We ought not to approve the cruelty of those who persecute the doctrine. Furthermore, we wish here again to testify that we will gladly maintain ecclesiastical and canonical government, provided the bishops only cease to rage against our churches. This, our desire, will clear us both before God and among all nations to all posterity from the imputation against us that the authority of bishops is being undermined, when our men read and hear that altogether protesting against the unrighteous cruelty of bishops, we could not obtain justice. What does this mean? Melanchthon is writing here that the Lutheran churches prefer episcopal government. They prefer this historical form of government where the churches are ruled by bishops, pastors, and deacons. Now, it also said in there that this tripartite office, the bishops, pastors, and deacons, that's a man-made thing. The office of the ministry is not, for that's how Christ governs and rules his church through the preaching of the gospel, through the administration of the sacraments. However, man very early on made this tripartite division, these divisions, or grades rather, in the office. So grades in the office exist by human right, whereas the office of the ministry itself exists by divine right. So what Melanchthon's saying there is, we desire to keep this because this is the one that the church has always known. Anything else past that, historically, or anything further than that into the future, to where we are now, that's a novum, a new thing in the church. And like all new things in the church, it ought to be carefully looked at to decide, is this the best way, or are the things that we have received from the fathers, are these better? Do these have more? Now I know what you're thinking. Bishops, the office of bishop, pastor, and deacon, this can be abused terribly, and it was in the medieval church. However, the abuse of something does not negate the usefulness of it. Just like the abuse of marriage doesn't mean that we should just annul all marriages and not have marriages. Or the abuse of the sacraments doesn't mean that we get rid of the sacraments. Instead, it calls for a proper use of it. In the Evangelical Lutheran Diocese of North America, the diocese to which I belong, we have restored this for the first time in North America, this idea, this tripartite, these grades of the office. We have a bishop, and he is a pastor. He has a congregation. He is also divinely called to serve as bishop, since it is a grade of the holy ministry. We also have ordained deacons, again, reflecting historically what we've seen throughout the church then, all the way from Paul and Ignatius, all the way through the Reformation. Personally, and again, this is me personally, having a bishop who is truly a bishop, an evangelical bishop, is far better, in my opinion, than having a bunch of bureaucrats, having a bunch of folks who were elected and have to politic and have to please people in their constituencies in order to stay in the office at the next election cycle. That's just me, and that's where I've come from. But it's also the Lutheran Confessions here. This is what we prefer. When it comes down to it, the office of the holy ministry is a gift of God to the church. And it can be abused, but it is still nonetheless a gift. And in that, we see how God governs his church. And historically, we see how he does that through those man-made grades in the office. I hope that answers your question. If it doesn't, shoot me another email. For that matter, if anybody of you out there have questions, fire me an email. atpholycross, all one word, atpholycross@gmail.com, and I'll answer them as I'm able. Thanks a lot for watching, all the way from Brazil, and thank you for your questions. We'll see you next time.